What's up guys, Kavika here with 9th App Studio, and in this video we're going to do a simple editing exercise where I take a shot like this and edit it to end up with this. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I know it's been a while since I've made a video. If you haven't been keeping track, it's probably been over a year. A lot has happened in that time. I got married, moved into this new place, we got a dog, painting of a dog rather, that's being walked by a hot dog, which is friggin' awesome. But I thought, since it's been so long, I'm going to take things easy. We're just going to take a simple shot that I took about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, in Maui of a waterfall, nicely centered with some brush on either side. And we're just going to take this from start to finish with an edit and see how much we can improve it. Alright, so here's the shot we're talking about. It's if you can't see it, it's DSC6333. I'll put a link to a Dropbox so you guys can download it and edit along. Link it will be in the description below. So I have a copy here, which I'm going to edit from scratch. This is the fully edited version, and we're going to start with this one, which has no edits applied to it. So let's go ahead and open that up. Okay, first things first, let's get to our lens profiles. We're going to remove chromatic aberrations and enable profile correction. Always start with that no matter what. Basic general rule of thumb, unless you have some lens that just doesn't show up on their profile. So, okay, first thing, let's go ahead and adjust the exposure. We're a little underexposed here. I can see now that we're moving the exposure up, we're getting some clipping in the highlights here, so let's bring those highlights back down, see if we can recover some of those clouds. And let's balance that a bit. That looks good. Let's see how much shadows we can recover. We're just going to try and recover as much data as possible, and then we'll make some edits to taste later. Okay, so done those. Now we've got kind of a flat image with those adjustments. Usually if you reduce highlights and increase the shadows, you end up with less contrast. So let's go ahead and increase the contrast a bit. Not too much. I don't want these black areas to be completely crushed, so I think that looks good. And then kind of by default, I shot this with an A7R Mark III. Usually what I'll just do is I'll just apply vibrancy at around 40. That seems to be a good amount, for my taste at least. You guys can choose whatever you want. From there, I think we've got a pretty good baseline to work with. So now what I want to do is I want to take a look at the shot and see what I want the viewer to actually pay attention to. In this case, obviously, it would be the waterfall. I've already composed it so that the waterfall is in the center, and I've used the brush here around the edges to kind of form somewhat of a foreground vignette. I don't know, I just kind of just made that up, but what I'm going to try and do now is I'm going to try and accent this focus of your view to the center. So what I like to do first is I like to use this gradient adjustment. And what I'll do is I'll create kind of a fake vignette. So I'll drag from the bottom left corner. I'll start in the bottom left and we'll drag inwards. Let's go ahead and reset this. Okay, so now it's doing nothing, but now I have this gradient here and it'll apply these adjustments just in this area and slowly taper off to the red. So the first thing I like to do is reduce the contrast quite a bit. You might not notice really what it's doing, but if I reduce the contrast in conjunction with reducing the exposure, what it does is it makes it a little bit darker and a lot less punchy. A lot of times I'll actually reduce the clarity as well, so let's see what that does. And now that we got this new texture thing here, I'm going to use that as well. Okay, I think that looks good. I don't want it crushed too much. Forget that. Okay, so just with this little adjustment, you can kind of see that it's made it a bit darker, but your eye isn't so much drawn to this foreground anymore. If I remove that, you can kind of see what it was before and after. So if I drag this, I can kind of see exactly what it's affecting. I think that's pretty good. So now I'm going to try on the other side. And since I did this adjustment already, it should apply the same adjustments to this gradient as well. So let's drag from the bottom right corner. think that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit less. So the bottom corners, I think I'm happy with that. We're getting pretty close to what I would like really quickly already. So let's go ahead and focus on the waterfall now. So it's in the center of the screen. I'm going to use the radial filter. And the same kind of technique, instead of adjusting the corners, I'm going to select the middle. And it's applied the same adjustment that I applied here. So let's go ahead and reset that and start from scratch again. So in reducing your attention to the corners, what I did was I reduced the contrast. Sometimes I'll reduce saturation, and sometimes I'll even reduce sharpness, because those are all things that draw your eye. So if I want your eye drawn here, I'll probably do the opposite. So I'll increase those things. So number one is I might increase exposure a little bit. I think that's nice. I don't want the highlights to be too bright, so maybe just a tad down on the highlights. Let's see if we can bring the shadows up a little bit. So immediately we can already see that this is starting to pop now. Another thing I like to do is I like to increase the temperature just a bit from the rest of the scene. It gives it a little color contrast as well. And then I'll go down to texture, increase that a tad. And I think I'll bring the shadows up a little bit more. And add a tiny bit of saturation. Cool, I like that. Okay, so we got the center of the shot, drawing your eye towards it. We got the corners down here, bottom left and right, not distracting from it. I think I want to see what it looks like if I try a similar technique on the top left and right corners. So I'm just going to click on this bottom left adjustment, this gradient filter, and it'll take the adjustments I've made here and apply them to the next gradient filter I make. So it's just a quick way to start with something. So I'm going to drag from this corner. Now right away you can see that it's kind of heavy-handed. So I'm going to reduce the adjustment a bit by bringing the exposure back up to normal. I do like that the contrast is lower, so I'm going to leave that where it is. But I think that's a nice middle ground. It's not too heavy-handed that you can tell it's been adjusted. And let's do this from the top right corner as well. This one I think I need a little bit more. There you go. Cool. I think that's pretty good for now. Let's go ahead and open this up in Photoshop, and we can make a few more adjustments there. Now at this point, I would be perfectly happy with the way the image looks right now, but I do have a plugin called the Knit Collection, which used to be owned by Google. Now it's owned by DxO or DOX, something like that. You can find it. It's called Color Effects Pro. I think it's like $30 to $40 or something like that, but it's a very cool plugin with a bunch of effects that I like to use from time to time. So if you have it, great, you can follow along, but if not, I would be perfectly happy, like I said, with this. Just a quick edit to draw your eye to the center and reduce the distractions from around the edges. Alright, let's take a look at Color Effects Pro. So I got the shot open right here. I'm going to go to Filters, Knit Collection, and Color Effects Pro 4. Now I do have a preset bunch of effects that I like to apply regularly, so I have them set here in my favorites on the left. They call it recipes, which is interesting, but if I click on that and hit yes, it'll apply these effects, but they're all turned off. So what I like to do is I have them left off, and then I turn them on one by one to see if I like what it's doing or not. So let's start with sunlight. If I click on sunlight, the defaults are going to be different from what you're seeing if you have the Knit Collection, but what I do is I have this set at 40% light strength, color temperature is at 5200, brightness 0, contrast 30, and saturation 0. I like this effect just for what it does with the light strength and adjusting the color temperature a bit, so let's turn it on and see what it does. Yeah, I think I like that. So it warms it up a bit, brings a little bit of life into the scene. If I turn it off, it brings a little bit of the information back from the shadows here in the bottom left, which I know I got rid of earlier, but maybe I was a little heavy-handed and this brought it back. So I do like what it does, so I'm going to leave that on. Let's go down to foliage. I usually have this set at method 2. Method 1 is a bit yellow orangey, and method 3 is really green, so I like the middle ground, and I have it set default to 20% right now. I like what it's doing, but I think it's a little heavy, so I'm going to reduce this to about 10%. Okay, let's skip color contrast, or contrast color range. I always get that mixed up. We'll skip polarization. I think we'll go down to pro contrast. So what this does is I have just the dynamic contrast turned up to 20% by default in this recipe. Dynamic contrast acts a little similar to, kind of similar to the clarity or the texture slider on an Adobe Camera Raw. So let's turn this on. And as you can see, it does add this kind of detail contrast. So I like what it's doing here in the center. It's adding a little bit of interest and detail here, but it's brightening up these corners a little bit too much and making them a little too visible. It's sort of distracting from what I want people to look at here in the center. So you have this little control point here, which you can add it's a minus sign to add a control point to remove this effect from a particular part of the image. So if I click on that and click on the corners here, you can see it remove the effect from that area. And if I drag this top little control point here, it'll make it bigger or smaller. So I'm just going to drag it so that it covers this bottom right corner. I'm going to add another one in the bottom left corner. And now these areas aren't so punchy that they're distracting from the main attraction, which is the waterfall. So next I have another pro contrast. This one I just have the correct color cast slider toggled on at 50%. It'll try and fix the white balance depending on what the scene has. So the scene's pretty green. I'm guessing it's going to add some sort of magenta hint to it if I turn it on. Yeah, so as you can see, it kind of reduced that green, and now you have this magenta kind of tinge to all of these rocks here. By doing this, I do kind of realize how green the scene is. So I kind of like what it does on a certain level, but I think I'm going to bring it back a little. I do like the nice vibrant greens here, so I'm going to turn it on, but I'm going to bring it back to maybe 20%. With it off, I do notice that these rocks here, they do have a green tinge to it, and it looks a little unnatural, so I do like what it's doing there. So I think I'll leave it at 20%, that's good. So let's skip down now to contrast only. This is an adjustment I like to use that really allows you to focus on what's important in the scene. So what I have it set to is brightness at 3, contrast at -12, and then the soft contrast I have it up to 35. What soft contrast does is it surveys larger areas of the scene and it makes adjustments to those broader areas rather than the fine details. Contrast kind of focuses a little bit more on the finer details. So especially in a scene like this where you have just so much going on, you have these, leafless trees here, you have all of these bigger leaves in the foreground, you have the waterfall, the rocks, there's just a lot going on. And if you increase the contrast too much, you start to lose the broader scene. And what soft contrast does is really allows you to see the forest from the trees. So let's reduce the regular contrast, increase the soft contrast, we'll turn that on. And now I feel like I can really focus on what's important. There's not so much distraction. So I like what it's doing, but a lot of times with this adjustment, you lose the deep blacks. So it brings the blacks up a little bit, and that's why I have this previous adjustment here called tonal contrast. And the only adjustment I have in there is shadow contrast. And if I check that, it'll just add a little bit more contrast in the shadows to anchor your photo. If you don't have a really strong black or darker portion of your photo, I like to say it kind of makes the photo float a little and doesn't really have a good anchor. So the black acts as the anchor to kind of just allow you to view the photo without it feeling like you're getting lost. This last adjustment is called skylight filters. It's very similar to something you would find on Instagram. It'll just add some warmth and brightness to it, little reds here. It does some color adjustments. It's a little fun adjustment I like to use on some of my photos, but sometimes it does a little too much, kind of like it's doing here. So it's really changing the colors, and I'm not sure I like it, so we're going to leave that off. I'm going to hit OK, and hopefully it doesn't crash. If you guys haven't updated your Nik collection as well as your Photoshop, sometimes if you have a mismatch, they tend to not work properly. So just a little lesson to save your work. So there you go. I mean, it's not the most spectacular shot in the world. It is a cool shot. It's a nice big waterfall, but it is like in the middle of the day. There's not very dynamic lighting, but it just goes to show you that there are some very simple things you can do in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop to improve a seemingly unspectacular photo and make it look a little bit better than it normally would. So anyway, I hope you guys learned something. Again, my name is Kaviko with 9th Ave Studio. Leave a comment below if you have any questions, and if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear that as well. As always, I'll catch you guys next time, and thanks for watching.